To our first University of Utah Lunch and Learn presentation. These Lunch and Learns are brought to you by the University of Utah Health Resiliency Center. And this resource is supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The contents are those of the instructors and do not necessarily represent the official views nor endorse HRSA, Health and Human Services, or the U.S. government. Okay, so we are going to turn the time over to Katie.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm excited to kick off this series. I am a clinical psychologist at the University of Utah and partnered with the Resiliency Center. I have a clinical practice over at Sugar House Health Center, so say hi to me if you're ever there. And part of what I do there is lead cognitive behavioral therapy groups for insomnia. You might not know this, but insomnia is the most common presenting problem of any mental or behavioral health condition that is seen in medical centers. So it's really nice that we're able to treat people there. So I have, over the last, 7 years, treated hundreds of people coming through with concerns of insomnia. And what I'm planning to do today is just talk a little bit about sleep. So my agenda is to start off with a little bit of myth busting. There's a lot about sleep in the media, and I want to talk a little bit about what's considered normal, what's considered just fine, and talk a little bit about how insomnia develops, and then some tips on making changes, some things that can be effective. But let me just say, I think it is a lot more interesting if these sessions are interactive. So if you have any things you have questions about, please put them into the chat and Priscilla will read them out to me and I'll do my best to answer it. It can be something related to what I'm talking about, or it can be some just random question that's on your mind. And I'm happy to answer both. But if nobody stops me, I'll just get going and start talking. So please get questions coming. And I think that'll make this a much more interesting session. Okay, so with that as the lead, and Priscilla, just interrupt me, because once I get talking, it's hard for me to slow down otherwise.
Okay.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about what typical sleep looks like. And I am going to get a little bit nerdy here, but I think it can be helpful. I'm going to start with just a one-night view of sleep and then get a little bit broader. Okay, so what we see here is a hypnogram. If anyone has ever been so fortunate as to go in for a sleep study, one of these of your brain waves are out there. What this is it's looking at the way that electrical impulses in your brain change across a night of sleep. So just to orient you to this graph, that bottom line is how long an individual has been asleep. And the top line are the stages of sleep or the alertness of your brain. So you can see that at awake, we're the most alert, our brain waves are the most active. And then REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, the period of sleep where we're dreaming, our brain is just about as active as it is when we're fully awake. Then you have the different stages of sleep. Light sleep, stage 1 and 2. This is what it feels like if you're in a boring meeting and you sort of halfway doze off, but you're still sort of aware of your surroundings. That's stage 1. All the way down into stage 4, deepest sleep, where you're not at all aware of your surroundings. You're very difficult to wake up. And if you do wake up, you're super groggy. Okay, so hopefully that orients you. So what you can see here is that we actually tend to get our deepest sleep in the beginning of the night. And we tend to have some periods of deep sleep that are alternated by periods of dreaming. Then through the night, we tend to have progressively lighter sleep. And you'll notice at the end of the night, this displays someone having back and forth between light sleep and dreaming and awake, and light sleep and dreaming and awake. So a couple interesting things I want to point out here. One is that period at the end of the night which is where people are often alternating between light sleep and awakeness and dreaming. People often subjectively report that as the feeling of sleep that just feels so good, like it's so hard to get up in the morning. And part of that is because the end of night sleep we're often just a little more aware of because our brains are more active. So it'll subjectively feel like that's the best sleep of the night. But if you're getting decent sleep, a lot of the deeper sleep is probably happening at the beginning of the night. You're just not aware of it. So that's one piece I like to point out. Another thing that's interesting is that even for somebody who gets pretty good sleep, again, this is just like an average across the population graph of decent sleep, it still generally takes someone 20-ish, 30-ish minutes to fall asleep at the beginning of the night. That's considered totally typical. It's also completely normal to wake up 2 or 3 times through the night and be up for 10, 15 minutes before drifting back to sleep. You can see how our sleep cycles to have more awake periods. So perhaps there are people with sleep problems in this listening to this who are thinking like, wow, I would really love to fall asleep within 30 minutes, or I'd really love to only be awake for 15 minutes. And if you're awake for hours, then that is a problem. But I've heard many people say that we've got this expectation that we should just be able to have our head hit the pillow and be unconscious for 8 hours. And that's really not how our brains work. So if you're getting up once or twice to use the bathroom or get a drink of water, know that you are just fine. All right, and again, if anyone has any questions on this or wants me to clarify, drop it into the chat. I'm happy to answer.
Okay, let's see. Is it common for people to get their best deep sleep in different orders?
So there's definitely variation individual to individual, but the deep sleep typically occurs at the beginning of the night. So you'll have some differences if you've been sleep deprived for a while. Our bodies tend to be really, really hungry for that stage 4 sleep, as well as for REM sleep, for the dream sleep. So if you've slept really terribly or had a couple bad nights, then your body is going to try to catch up on the REM sleep and on the rebound, or sorry, on the REM sleep and on the deep sleep. It'll rebound that way. So you might end up with more intense deep sleep or sometimes more vivid dreams as your body tries to catch up on that. But in general, for most people, deep sleep, you tend to get your best deep sleep at the beginning of the night. And then just on that topic, and again, great question, and shout out more if anything else comes up. I like to show this too, just so people can have a sense of how much of each stage of sleep we're supposed to get. So this is again an approximation, but what you can see here is that we tend to spend about half of the night in lighter sleep, stage 1 or 2 sleep. And the percentage of deep sleep, stage 3 and 4, is really a relatively small percentage, less than a quarter of our night. And REM sleep, that dreaming sleep, is pretty small as well, only about 20%, again, in a healthy adult. And I just like to point this out because I have a lot of people who are checking their Fitbits all the time. And maybe your Fitbit is telling you that you're getting too much light sleep. Odds are you're probably fine. We're supposed to get a lot of light sleep and have our brains move in and out of these different stages. All right, so now I'm going to take a step back. I warned you I'm getting nerdy. This is a little bit nerdy here, but I still think this is something that's useful for understanding how sleep works. So you can think of sleep as being influenced by 2 different drives. So the first drive, see all those down pointy arrows, that is your sleep homeostatic drive, sleep load. I'll usually just call it a sleep drive. You can think of that as your appetite for sleep. As you go through the day, the longer that it's been since you've been asleep, the higher your appetite for sleep is going to get. So your sleep drive should peak as you're ready to go to bed and then becomes smaller through the night, just like your physical hunger, your hunger for food. And this can be part of why if you have a nap, it can take a big chunk out of that drive for sleep, making it harder to go to sleep. Much like if you have a snack before dinner, you might not be as hungry for dinner when it's time. Now, if sleep drive was the only variable that influenced our sleep, nobody would ever have had the experience of being super tired, physically exhausted, and laying down in bed and just not being able to doze off, no matter how tired you are. And that is because this is a two-part model. You have competing a circadian alerting signal that is keeping you awake through the day. So you can think of this as stress hormone. You can think of this as all of the different stimulus from our environment that are keeping us going through the day. This tends to increase through the day and then drop off at night. So ideally, if somebody's a good sleeper, what they'll experience is toward evening, their sleep drive will be at its highest, and your alerting signal will be starting to fade, and you'll drift off into sleep in a beautiful dance of slumber. But one thing that can go wrong is there can be various factors that keep your alerting signal high. So things like stress, lights from the environment, too much caffeine too late in the day, all of those things can keep that alerting signal going past when it's supposed to and can defeat that sleep drive and keep you from drifting off. So that's one piece of where insomnia can start to develop if these two forces are not lined up. Just going to pause a second, see if anyone drops any questions in. Okay. So I'm going to back out one more step. This is what sleep looks like across the lifespan. So you can see that our sleep needs tend to decrease throughout the course of our life. And I assume there's not too many babies who are employees for y'all, so I'm going to move on to the young adult, older adult area.
David, you want to ask your question?
Oh, please.
David? All right, David, I see your hand up. If you want to ask your question anytime, Katie can answer.
Yep.
Continue on.
Just jump on in. All right. So what I like to show here is average amounts of sleep that are needed. So you can see in the young adult area, that dark blue line, the dark blue section of the graph, is what most adults need. So most adults need 7 to 9 hours. But that lighter blue on either side is the amount that is still considered okay. It's a little bit less usual for an adult to need 10 hours of sleep or to feel perfectly fine on 6 hours of sleep. But it's not usually going to be considered a health risk. So the magic 8 hours of sleep that you hear so much about in the news that all of us need, that's an average. So much like having a size 9 shoe is average, but having a size 6 shoe is also perfectly fine. 8 hours of sleep is just average. And everybody's individual need is going to be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So I put this out there because some people really don't need 8 hours of sleep, and that's fine. Or they might need closer to 9 or 10, and that is fine as well. If it gets much above or much below that, then maybe that's something to talk with your doctor about. But anywhere in that 7 to 9 range for an adult, and even in the 6 to 10 range, is also considered perfectly fine. Do we see another question pop in?
No, I don't see
Okay,
one.
all right. The other thing I like to point out here is that once you're an adult and you've sort of figured things out and feel like you know what your body's needs are, well, then we just go and change again. as we continue to age. So over the age of approximately 65, our sleep needs tend to decrease a little bit more. It's not inevitable that older adults are going to have bad sleep. That's something I've heard, and that's just not true. But generally, there is a decreased need for sleep. And this can get coupled with spending the same amount of time in bed that you needed at 40, but now you're 68 and you need less time. And what can occur then is that it can start to feel like insomnia. And I'll tell a story on my mom for this, since I know she's not in this presentation. So I got a call from my mom that she was starting to have trouble sleeping. She's waking up at 4 a.m. and thinks she needs to go to her doctor and get on some sleep medications. So I asked her, like, when are you going to bed? Turns out she'd started going to bed at around 8 o'clock. No kids in the house. She'd just watch TV, drift off early, and go to bed at 8. So I did a little finger math. Mom, you're getting plenty of sleep. You don't have insomnia. And you definitely don't need medications for that. So either shifting back her bedtime or just embrace that she's the woman who likes to get up and walk the neighborhood at 4 a.m. was the best thing for her to do. Now, for many people with insomnia, it is not that easy of a solution, but keeping in mind that your body's needs might change over the course of your life can also be really helpful. All right, so this is.
So why does it seem that older people sleep more?
So the sleep needs do tend to be less. As people age, though, part of what can occur are different changes in health conditions. So if people have different chronic health conditions, then that can result in needing more sleep. But often what you'll really be seeing is just a disrupted pattern of sleep. So napping during the day and then having longer awake periods at night, rather than truly needing more sleep. If someone who is suddenly needing more sleep into adulthood, I want them to talk to their doctor and just make sure that there's nothing else going on with their health that's making them need more sleep.
So should they be adding it up? Like if you took a nap and then how much?
Yep. Yep. You can think of that nap as just taking a big bite out of whatever your amount of sleep is that you need later. Okay. All right. So let's see, I've got about 8 minutes left. Any other questions? All right, so a little bit about what can go wrong with sleep. So I'll skip the graph for the next thing because I'll take too long talking. No, I won't skip the graph. I'll still show it. Okay, so nerdy, again, warned you that I'm nerdy. This is one of the models of insomnia. So imagine you are the same person at each of these stages. So each of us have a different predisposition to insomnia. That's the purple bar. Some people are pretty lucky, and it takes a lot of stress, that's that blue line, to bump you over the threshold into insomnia. Everyone is going to have insomnia at some point in their life. Some people are more sensitive to it than others. I can smell caffeine, just like coffee at the other end of the hall after 2 p.m. and I won't be able to sleep. My husband can chug a Mountain Dew right before bed and he's going to be fine. It's just different predispositions to insomnia. So that acute stress setting off insomnia is totally normal. And for most people, the stress goes away, the insomnia is going to resolve. So a night or two of bad sleep, it's unpleasant, but it's not that big of a deal. What ends up happening, though, is sleep problems can take on a life of their own. So often people will do things that help them to cope with the insomnia, to just get through and survive your next day after a bad night of sleep, that they can end up then perpetuating the problems with sleep. So for example, I'll hear many people say that they're worried they're not going to be able to sleep. So they end up trying to spend more time in bed. Go to bed early, stay in bed late with hopes of just capitalizing on sleep. However, that can lead to your brain starting to associate bed with wakefulness. So that's one thing I do want to talk about as my hopeful tip is the idea of stimulus control, or building up the association between bed and sleep. So most people have heard a lot of the sleep hygiene tips, like make sure your room is dark and quiet and comfortable. Make sure there's not like a dog jumping on your stomach in the middle of the night. Most people know those things. So I want to talk kind of next level about stimulus control, or building a strong association in your brain between bed and sleep. So if you think of getting into the car, the second you get in the car, what are you doing? You buckle your seatbelt. You don't even think twice about it, right? You back down the driveway. If you're standing in front of your fridge, what are you doing? You're getting some food out, right? That association, fridge equals food, car equals go somewhere. Those are like solid in our brain. But bed, if you're laying in bed, what might you be doing? Maybe you're asleep. Maybe you're doom scrolling on your phone. Maybe you're watching Netflix. Maybe you're reading. Maybe you're arguing with your partner. Maybe you're just avoiding the rest of your family. There are many, many, many things that can be done in bed, so that when you get into bed, your brain does not have that automatic association of bed equals sleep. So this is one of the big things that when I'm working with people insomnia, I advise them to do, even for a couple week period, of really boot camp themselves to have nothing but the 3 S's in bed. So sleep, sickness, sex are the 3 S's of things that are the okay to do in bed things if you're trying to improve insomnia. If you don't have insomnia, then it's not as big of a deal. But if there are problems with sleeping, then boot camping this association can be really important. Because here's what can happen is if you're in bed awake all the time, bed starts to become associated with insomnia. And that means you're laying there feeling frustrated, and your bed is associated with the worrying that happens. And you want to avoid that. So ironically, that can look like spending too much time in bed because you want to maximize the amount of sleep. Or maybe you're spending time on your phone, or again, TV, or worrying. So bed becomes associated with all of this negative pieces. So getting back to where bed is just associated with sleep is one of the first steps in starting to improve insomnia. I'm just going to pause for a second, see if there's any questions there.
Yeah, so I think back on the slide that you had, I think the circadian rhythm and stuff, there's a question. The early graph showed a dip about 3 p.m. If you could comment on that, why there's that dip.
Yes, there is a dip at about 3 p.m. And so that's something that's very normal. In some cultures, it's pretty normal to take a nap at around that time. So that afternoon slump, it is not just you, that is your biology. And it can be good to just prepare for that a little bit. If it's possible to, if you have the flexibility in your schedule to take a break at around that 2-3 p.m. post lunchtime, that's great. Or it might be a good time to go on a walk, do a little bit of exercise, get some sunshine to pull yourself through that slump. But that is absolutely a real thing. Were there any other questions?
Nope, not right now. So I guess one thing on this bed and sleep thing. So say you're like sitting there in bed and you can't fall asleep and you're finding all these distractions. I think I've heard that, right? It's best to just get up out of bed and go do something else.
That is absolutely one of the recommendations. And y'all, it is so hard to make yourself do that. But if you plan for it ahead of time, it's a lot easier to do. So one of the main recommendations is if you find yourself, it's been 15 or so minutes, you know you're just not going to go back to sleep, get up and out of bed, do something calming. So I recommend reading is my top recommendation, or listening to music, or a relaxing podcast, probably not a murder podcast, a relaxing podcast. TV is actually not the worst thing if you can pick something boring that's not going to suck you in, and if you can keep the lights pretty dim. And then when you start to feel tired again, go back to bed. It's really hard to do that because you just want to get as much sleep as possible. But if you're trying to break that association of bed equals insomnia, you want the insomnia to be happening on the couch, not in the bed. So other similar recommendations, sorry, were you gonna ask something else, Priscilla?
No.
Okay. So that's one of the big ones for the stimulus controlled bed equals sleep. Also, not going to bed before you're tired. Believe it or not, one of the most effective recommendations for people with insomnia is I make them go to bed a couple hours later. It's really hard to get buy-in on that, you can imagine. But it can still be something that is extremely effective to do because you're waiting until you're tired to go to bed, and then you'll fall asleep faster, and then you'll build up that bed equals sleep association. So I'm going to fast forward to some resources. There we go. Oops, too far, but there's my dog. All right. So I'm going to point out the CBTI Coach resource. This is a free app that's developed through the Department of Defense, through the VA, but it's made for everybody. This is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, the same kind of therapy that I lead at the University of Utah, but in an app. You track your sleep on it, and it gives you recommendations for how to adjust your sleep schedule in order to improve insomnia. Believe it or not, it is as effective as in-person therapy with a real human, which just goes to show one day we'll all be replaced by robots, but that's okay. This can be a really effective resource. And then these two books are ones that I recommend as well. They'll walk you through a lot of the same things that we've been discussing and have good science-based strategies for how to improve insomnia. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you everybody for attending today. And hope that this was helpful for you.
Thank you, Katie, for your time. Everyone, have a good afternoon.